Good day to everybody from here in London, and thank you for tuning into this video. So, as the title suggests, the aim of the video is to help the many people that are either at risk of being laid off or have unfortunately been laid off already. And so we have with us Lee Jefcott from Brabners. Hello.
Hello.
And Lee's going to be answering a few questions that I have for him. Before I introduce Lee, just want to make a couple of points for context. So, my first point is that this video was prompted by the recent layoffs at Salesforce.com, and obviously I was there for more than 10 years. But I want everyone to share this video as far and wide as possible, and that's because these layoffs are happening not just at Salesforce, but they're happening at Google and Microsoft and Amazon and everywhere else. And it's not just limited to people who work in tech. So if you're aware of anybody who may be at risk or has, sadly been laid off recently, then, please share this video so that they can see it as well. And we just want to make sure that, that everyone has a baseline understanding of sort of what to expect, from being at risk or being laid off. My second point is that Lee's jurisdiction is specifically the UK. So if you're watching this from outside the UK, then please keep watching and sharing. But just be aware that the laws in your country are going to vary probably quite significantly. So that being said, we're posting this to YouTube and LinkedIn. So if you're in another country, then please just let us know in the comments. And if there's sufficient demand, then we'll do what we can to get you onto someone that can help you where you are. So without further ado, please let me introduce Lee Jefcott, partner at Brabners, the law firm, and a specialist in employment law. So first of all, Lee, why don't you introduce yourself and your firm and let us know what you're about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for inviting me on. So I'm an employment lawyer. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is advising some businesses, but also individuals on things like exits from businesses. So particularly happening a lot at the moment, as you've said, in the tech sector and the IT sector, some big numbers I think we've seen out there as well, unfortunately, and that has led to quite an increase in the need for legal advice in the area. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, what sort of trends are you seeing as an employment lawyer in the tech space specifically?
So really, it's around, I suppose one issue is kind of, when people are being taken on, it's the basis on which they're engaged. Are they, going to contract or be employees or whatever else? But what I'm seeing much more of at the moment is the other side of the equation, which is obviously when people are leaving. And as I say, we've seen some big numbers, and particularly around employees. So if you're a contractor, it's a bit of a different story, but we're really talking today about employees and layoffs and redundancies. So quite a big uptick in that area in terms of people needing help. Okay,
thank you for that. And so, with layoffs and redundancies, how does it work? And the reason I asked that question is because I think this happened to me, about 20 years ago, and the whole thing came as a big shock and surprise. And I was completely ignorant to what to expect and the process. So I think it'd be useful just for people to get an understanding of sort of what happens and how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. It usually starts off with what's called an at-risk meeting. So, and there's usually an announcement the same day. So you'll see that the announcement goes out, and then all the employees at risk will be invited to join an online meeting of some sort. And there's a general announcement followed by individual at risk meetings. So you'll generally then go into what's called a consultation process about the redundancy. So the employer kind of explaining the reasons for the redundancies, the numbers, why you're affected, your particular role. Sometimes it's selection, why you've actually been selected for redundancy. And the process usually goes on for at least a few weeks, and then can end in a sort of termination of employment situation. But often there's another route as well where the business actually offers a deal. So would seek to have a conversation with you to try to, shorten the process, make it a bit more understandable. And there's usually financial terms that are then negotiated, and you usually end up in what's called a settlement agreement.
Okay. And as a tech employee, how should you respond to this?
Well, I mean, it's always difficult at first, isn't it? Because, I mean, the news is often a shock, unexpected. And your immediate thought, of course, is you your finances and your family or personal situation. How am I going to carry on paying the mortgage or the rent and all that kind of thing. But when the sort of thought settles, often it's, you're looking at practicalities really, aren't you? You're looking at, is this a decision I can or need to challenge? Is the scope, and we'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later on. But what's the financial terms is really what people want to know, and the timescales of all of this. And of course, looking for another job, it's practical. That's the other alternative, isn't it? But until you've sorted out your arrangements with your existing employer, it's often quite hard to sort of, get your head into finding something else. Yeah,
for sure. So then, as an employee, what sort of scope do you have to sort of challenge these things, challenge like a layoff or a redundancy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because often, once the shock dies down, people are questioning, sometimes, well, why is it me? The business is still carrying on, my particular role might still be carrying on, so why have I been chosen? Sometimes it's more serious, where you're looking at the whole closure of a whole bunch of people, a whole team, and there's an obvious redundancy situation there. But in other cases, it may be possible to sort of challenge the process. Why am I redundant? Has it been a fair process used? So for employees with more than 2 years service as an employee, they do have unfair dismissal rights, and the employer is therefore required to have a proper reason for termination and to follow a reasonable and fair process.
I mean, do you have examples of what might be considered like unfair?
Yeah, I mean, there's some obvious examples. So, selecting for someone for redundancy on the basis of an unreasonable and prohibited ground, such as, maternity leave, or the fact that they're perceived to be inflexible, they're not going to, they refuse to work certain hours, they've been off sick, there are all sorts of, issues that could affect the redundancy, in which some employees say, well, that's why I've been selected or chosen. So there's often a sort of checklist to work through in terms of, seeing whether the decision can be challenged on a legal basis.
Yeah. So when it happened to me, my employer offered me a package, and I to be honest, I just accepted it because I didn't really know what else to do at the time. But with the benefit of hindsight, I would probably ask you the question, how should I decide whether I'm better off taking the deal, or not?
Yeah, so really, I mean, that's probably one of the first questions that people will think about when when they're confronted with these sorts of situations. And I think, there is a basic entitlement on redundancy. So obviously the employer's got to pay you notice, under your contract, because they'll be terminating employment. So absolutely check how much notice you're entitled to. It could be 3 months, it could be more, it could be less. It depends on how long you've been there and what the contract says. But also there is a statutory redundancy payment. So any employee with more than 2 years service is entitled to a redundancy payment. And again, that is a formula depending on length of service. But quite often what employers do is they offer individuals an enhanced redundancy payment, or sometimes called a severance payment, or, a deal. It might be an extra few months' pay. If they will enter into a settlement agreement to basically release the company from any claims, so it's kind of like a waiver, and draw land under the whole thing, and, allow the consultation to stop, because nobody really wants to go through a lengthy process with these things. So that's really where the deal comes in, and often there'll be a separate sort of discussion and perhaps an offer of terms that comes through on that basis.
Okay. Is that like a typical deal, and, are the things that you just mentioned the things that are included in a typical deal? I mean, what does a typical deal look like, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So definitely notice pay, and it might be that, often there's no requirement to work notice, so employers often will make a payment in lieu. So you get the money without having to work, which is, usually beneficial. Sometimes people are put on garden leave, they're asked to sort of stay at home, and the contract sort of stays in place for a while. But quite often it's a payment in lieu. Redundancy payment, enhancement, there's often a tax consideration. So you're thinking, well, actually, okay, I've got to pay tax on my notice pay, but redundancy monies are usually tax-free up to a certain figure. The other thing is other elements of the package. So what about shares? Quite often people may have some kind of share scheme, restricted stock units or share options, something like that. There could be a great deal of value there, so that's often worth looking into quite carefully. You might also find commission, bonuses. How should those be dealt with in the agreement? And that's where often there's an element of negotiation that can help.
I mean, that's interesting. So, speaking of negotiation, what would be the process for agreeing a deal, short of just signing whatever's put in front of you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you said slightly earlier, I think perhaps a lot of people just do agree whatever is put in front of them without actually realising that there can be negotiation. So, if you don't, I always follow the sort of, if you don't ask, you don't get kind of analogy. So yes, you can, and it may be that you don't feel as confident in negotiating a deal, and ultimately, if you are going to go down the deal route, there will be the need to get hold of an employment lawyer at some stage, because often the employment lawyer needs to sign the settlement agreement to make it actually work legally. So why don't you engage with that employment lawyer a little earlier, and perhaps discuss what the negotiation might be, what your requirements are, and see whether the employment lawyer can approach HR or your line manager or whoever it is to start that process going.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you. I think as soon as you get into the realms of I guess possibly challenging what they put in front of you and seeking something better, then you're very much into the sort of throes of employment law, and I suspect that your approach to it has to be very specific, and in that situation, I would presume that a lawyer is essential. But beyond having a lawyer on side, what tips would you give me, for example, if I wanted to get a better deal, for negotiating a better deal?
Yeah, I think it's always a good idea to have at least a preliminary chat with someone who's been around the block quite a few times with these things. Yeah. So have a chat with a lawyer. It doesn't have to be the lawyer who goes back and negotiates for you. Mm-hmm. Quite often individuals say, well, actually, if I know what I'm talking about with a bit of guidance, I'm happy to handle the discussion. I know my line manager really well. I know or the whoever it is you're discussing it with, the head of the business. I know them well, so I'd feel more comfortable having that discussion myself. In some situations, others are a bit more kind of, I just want you to send them an email and see whether we can get an improved deal. So it can be done in a number of different ways. But what I would say is, be confident. You've worked there in the organisation, you've given them all of your talent and skills for, however many years. So it's not an unreasonable thing to do to seek to have that conversation. Absolutely.
That's great. Thank you, Lee. So I think that sets a good baseline for people that are watching the video, and if they want further information, they can always click on the link and request that. And I know that what you've told us is going to be helpful to a lot of people. So again, thank you for that. That's fantastic, Lee. And hopefully, if we get lots of questions coming through off the back of this, then we'll be sure to forward them on to you, and maybe get back to the viewers with further answers if we need to. But thank you so much for your time in this instance. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you.